Okay. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Today's Wednesday, October 14th. You are at the Kubernetes K8s Infra Working Group bi-weekly meeting. I am your host today, Aaron Rickenberger. It's also SpiffXP on all the places. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted publicly later. So we ask that everybody adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which you can find in any repo under the file codeofconduct.md. If you have any problems with our behavior during this meeting, you're welcome to reach out either to me or to the conduct@kubernetes.io email address. Okay, so like I was sort of discussing before we pressed record, there was nothing really on the agenda for today, so I expect we'll keep it light. But I will sort of run through two things. And I turned my screens off. I'll be right back with you. So I'll paste a link to the agenda in chat if folks want to put their name in as attendees or if they have anything else they want to add to the agenda. And let's see, so we kind of did it off camera, but as usual, are there any new members or attendees here who would like to introduce themselves?
Sure, I can go. Hi, I'm Eddie Zaneski. I work for AWS as a developer advocate. I've been spending most of my time working full-time on Kubernetes for the past few months. I'm on the 1.20 release team as a CI signal shadow, and I mostly spend most of my time under SIG CLI, where I'm realizing I have to go lead a meeting in 20 minutes there, so I may have to drop off early, but thanks for having me, and I'm just here to learn all I can.
Cool. Welcome, Eddie. Anybody else? Okay. So I'm going to start by looking at our billing report and seeing if I can share my screen with everybody once I find the right window. Okay, that share screen, that one. Okay, can everybody see that? It looks like we've spent about a little over 100 grand and 100,000 in the last 28 days. Let's take a look at our daily spend. This is where we sort of break it down by project and then by cloud service as well. So as expected, we're seeing really periodic bumps during the weekdays versus the weekend. The majority of this traffic or this cost is likely coming from our K8s.gcr.io artifact hosting. So I'm going to go ahead and look for the artifacts project and filter that out. And so that's roughly how much our CI and staging builds and public-facing infrastructure like Slack Infra and Triage Party and all that are costing us. None of this seems too wildly surprising to me. So unless there are any questions, I think I'll move forward. Okay. So next up, let's talk briefly about where we are with migrating Prow. Briefly, I think we may be aware of this, but just to refresh. So Prow is the thing that runs all of the CI for Kubernetes. It runs on the order of 10,000 jobs a day. We think of Prow architecturally in terms of a service cluster. That's what you talk to when you talk to prow.k8s.io. And then a bunch of build clusters. So Prow can schedule specific jobs as pods on different build clusters. Today, a while back in April, we put forward a plan on creating 2 build clusters within the CNCF or community-owned Google project. It was a K8s Infra Prow build and K8s Infra Prow build trusted. Sort of here. So the initial spike, let me see if I can navigate to where those are in the repo, actually, that might help. So the initial spike was basically standing these up with Terraform and then putting a bunch of Kubernetes manifests next to the Prow clusters. So if I go to the code, all of our code for standing up and managing clusters within this is in the infra GCP clusters directory. And then we have a layout of which project the cluster is hosted under. And so we'll talk about the Prow build cluster. So the README here sort of describes what had to happen in order to stand this up. Terraform can be a little racy or wonky, so kind of had to like do some things manually and run Terraform a couple times. But otherwise it is basically stood up. And then within this build cluster, we have things like Greenhouse, which is our Bazel remote cache. We have a couple things to tune the cluster itself. So like setting a default limit range for memory and CPU, doing things like for the benefit of kind, we make a bunch of loopback devices on each of the nodes, tuning the some of the iNotify settings on all of the nodes via daemon set, so on and so forth. And then we also have our own Boscos instance. So Boscos is the thing that is responsible for handing out or managing pools of resources. What we most often use it for here in Kubernetes is to manage pools of GCP projects. So these are just a bunch of GCP project names. And when an end-to-end job wants to stand up a Kubernetes cluster somewhere, it's going to get an end-to-end project out of this. It's going to stand it up, and then when it's done, it'll check it back in, and Boscos has a janitor that's responsible for cleaning it all up. So I tried to go a little deeper into explaining what's in the build cluster, because there's also another build cluster inside google.com called default, which is where a lot of jobs run. And so we've been trying to migrate all the release blocking jobs over to the community-owned build cluster, since the release blocking and the merge blocking jobs are kind of like the highest traffic and also most critical jobs for the functioning and release of Kubernetes. There are roughly 1,700 and something jobs in total, but not all of these jobs relate to Kubernetes, the project. And many of these jobs relate to Kubernetes sub-projects and stuff, which we want to support for sure, but I think the priority would be the Kubernetes specific jobs first. And then thanks to the sort of CI policy effort that we had between July, August, and September, we sort of pushed on migrating all of the jobs to this build cluster. And part of that was saying that all the critical jobs, so release blocking and merge blocking, they have to declare all their resources, but their requests and their limits, so that the scheduler can be really smart about placing pods where they'll have enough resources. And the cluster itself can auto scale when it knows it doesn't have enough resources available. This is different than the default build cluster, which does not auto scale, and all of the jobs that run in there don't declare their resources. So it's really possible for jobs to land on nodes with noisy neighbors, which is probably what has been happening lately with the build jobs, which are the remaining jobs of the release blocking jobs that need to be migrated. So build master fast. We'll just choose fast as an example. So if I look at its duration, it, stuff. I think this actually may have been a bash script problem somewhere, but like these random timeouts like this are most likely the job just landing on a really busy node in the default cluster. The reason these jobs still have to live inside of the default cluster is because right now all of the jobs are set up to write to this Google Cloud Storage bucket called Kubernetes release dev, and it lives inside of a google.com owned project, and the policies on that project do not allow non-google.com accounts to write to it. Um, that's just the way that is. So as long as we run inside of a google.com owned build cluster, we can write to the google.com owned bucket. But we want to run in a non-google.com cluster. So we need to find a non-google.com bucket to write to. Doesn't appear that we have any way to transfer a bucket name from one project to another. So we worked through proposing different bucket names to use. I opted for K8s release instead of Kubernetes release. And I believe those buckets now exist and are writable by the Proud build cluster in the community. And I think Cpanato, I forget what their name is. I really should get better about this. I think he created a job that migrates over. Yeah, he created a canary job that should run in the build cluster over in the community. And I sort of tried to spell out at the bottom here, step by step, what I would recommend that the community do to like create duplicate jobs that write to the new bucket, and then alter existing jobs that pull from the old bucket to pull from the new bucket. And as long as all that works, we can just gradually shift stuff over to using the new buckets and stop using the old buckets. And hopefully that will unblock most of the release blocking and merge blocking jobs. What to do about the remaining jobs? We're going to have to sort of figure that out, I think. Part of the reason I say we're going to have to figure that out is from a billing perspective. Right now, I have no way to describe. I'll stop sharing my screen. I have no way to describe. Like I think in an ideal world, we'd love to be able to give each SIG sort of their own budget and say, here's your budget, and you decide like which projects need which jobs and which tests to spend that budget. And right now, we don't have a way to assign costs to a specific SIG. End-to-end tests end up consuming resources not just on the build cluster themselves, but they also consume resources by spinning up clusters in the cloud. And so getting like all of that assigned to a single bucket, if that's the approach we want to take, we need to figure out how to engineer that sort of system. My rough thought was like, since we've mostly taken care of the release blocking and merge blocking, the next logical thing might be the release informing jobs, which are not supposed to be hard blocks on the release, but are useful for informing us about whether or not the release is good to go from sort of a broader perspective. So I know that's kind of where the 5,000 node scalability tests live, and that may be where OpenStack and a couple other cloud providers have their tests at the moment. So that is roughly that at the moment. Did that answer your questions, Eddie, or do you have more specifics?
No, that was actually super insightful. Thank you for walking through that.
Yeah.
I had a question that came up, I guess around Bosco's. Is there a reason there's so many projects as opposed to just like one that hands out resources? Is it like the noisy neighbor problem?
Yeah, essentially we want to, at least in Google Cloud, a project is kind of like the almost like logical namespacing. I mean, like quotas and IAM stuff are also tied to projects, but that gives us the freedom to have a job create whatever cloud resources it wants, and it won't interrupt or stomp over top of other jobs. This way we can ensure that like the simplest case would be we have a bunch of jobs that create a bunch of clusters, and if we were to point too many of them at a single GCP project, we might find that they stomp over top of each other naming wise, or they eventually hit that project's quota for like nodes or network or IPs or whatever. So it's just, it really simplifies management to have just a pool of generic projects we can check out.
Cool.
Uh, I, I don't know if it's this way anymore. At least like when I was using AWS a lot more actively, I sort of thought like, I'm going to check out a VPC and I'll create whatever I want within that VPC, and I don't need to really interrupt anything else. And then I can tear down that VPC and all the associated resources, and it's fine. I think like Cluster API uses a pool of accounts instead, so that maybe account is the better sort of isolation boundary.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Oh, Arno, did you have a question?
Yeah, about this issue, do we need to to update the scenario? Because I saw some scenarios in test Infra using the old bucket. I'm not sure what it's doing.
So I don't know is the short answer. Slightly longer answer is I'm gonna trust or ask that the release engineering team kind of look into that. I trust that they are the team that's in charge of the jobs that uses those scenarios most often. So if I would trust that they know what needs to be changed. I'm trying to talk just sort of specifics about the buckets and stuff. Um, it seems like all that needs to happen is changing some flags in the job config. Like, I don't think any code has to be changed. I think just making sure that flags that tell the scenarios which buckets to publish to, or vice versa, the end-to-end test jobs, which bucket to consume builds from. Yeah, in an ideal world, the scenarios are actually, we shouldn't be using we shouldn't be using them because technically scenarios are related to Bootstrap, which is a legacy thing that we used prior to the existence of kubetest and also prior to the existence of Prowse job decoration, or we also call that pod utils, which are the things that are responsible for like clone this repo and put it in a known space, and then when you're done, upload the artifacts from this well-known location to a well-known bucket in the cloud and stuff. Pod utils are much more actively supported than Bootstrap in all of the scenarios. So ideally, we would stop using scenarios entirely, but I'm not sure like how much tech debt is tangled up in all that.
Okay, I will ask to Stephen.
Okay. Cool. So next up, Claudio had a question about Docker Hub. So let me share. So this is, I created this issue in the testing for repo titled Mitigate Docker Hub Changes Rolling Out November 1st. The TLDR is Docker Hub is going to rate limit pulls of images from Docker Hub. If we are anonymous, we'll be rate limited to 100 over 6 hours per IP. If we're authenticated, we're limited to 200, regardless of what IP address we're coming from. And if we use a paid plan, we get unlimited pulls. So our concern or our worry is that this rate limit is applied across all images. And so even if we're worried that even if we fix the really common case of the images that we care about, the long tail of images that come from Docker Hub may result in random nodes on our build clusters hitting that rate limit and then not working for a bunch of different jobs. And because it's by IP, it might start looking like jobs might randomly start failing depending upon which node and which build cluster they are scheduled to. So it might look really confusing and annoying. So one option is we just fork over the cache for a paid plan and then figure out how to pass the credentials for that all across our build cluster nodes, which, you know, the things responsible for like running unit tests and running integration tests, the things responsible for building things that use Docker images. So like the Kubernetes build job pulls down some Docker images during its build process. Or the various Google Cloud build jobs that are responsible for building images that are hosted in the K8s.gcr.io image repository. So that's one option. We pass the credentials through all that. Another option is we look at setting up a pull-through cache for Prow and all of its build clusters. And then ideally people wouldn't need to change what images they're using at all. Another option is we rely on, Google provides some level of mirroring. I don't know if I have it linked here. Okay, yeah. Google provides mirror.gcr.io, which caches a number of commonly used Docker images. So your Alpines, your BusyBoxes, your Golangs, your Pythons, stuff like that are available at this repo, and we would not be rate limited in pulling from it. And I believe by default, all GKE clusters are set up to, are configured to have this as a mirror. So when we pull from Docker, we actually look to see if we can pull from this mirror first. I have not found a way to prove that that is what is actually happening in the nodes available on the build cluster logs. But this may already be happening and may actually take care of us in most of the common cases. The other option is we, look at building a pull-through cache ourselves to handle whatever images we're not catching. So that's the stuff at a high level. Focusing specifically on Kubernetes, since that's our highest traffic thing. Antonio pointed out that it really looks like these are the only remaining images that are that come from Docker Hub that are used in A2E tests. So what we could do is look at pulling these. So first, we either determine whether or not we're transparently using mirror.gcr.io. If we're not, we could explicitly reference that and just update these, update the Docker library registry to a mirror.gcr.io /docker/library, I think. The alternative is we could try mirroring this, we could try setting up jobs that mirror these images into K8s.gcr.io and pull from there. So that was just looking at the code. Some other approaches I've tried to take are looking at the kubelet logs from all of our build clusters and looking at what they pull down. This lines up pretty well with what Antonio found for Kubernetes. We don't seem to be pulling down a lot on the community-owned build cluster, and I'm still working on getting this data from the default google.com build cluster because it was stood up with logs in a different format a long time ago. So trying to see if I can parse out something similar there. Another option could be using something like Hound or cs.k8s.io to see if we could look at like all of the Docker files and pulling out their from lines to see what those reference. And I also took the approach of just parsing out the image field from all of the prow jobs to understand what images we consume. And so most of the images that we're getting from Docker Hub are the really popular ones that are likely mirrored by mirror.gcr.io. So we may be in the clear. It's the long tail of images that I'm less certain about what to do. We could recommend that people push them into staging. I think my concern and probably Tim's concern might be we want to make sure that these mirrors are used by the Kubernetes project and not necessarily by the world, just sort of the way the funding works. I have no problem using mirror.gcr.io because that's something that Google on the whole provides, but I think Kubernetes, the project, should not be funding artifact mirroring for the world. It should be funding artifact mirroring for the benefit of Kubernetes CI. So we could look at authentication or whatever to lock those mirrors down. Questions?
I'm not sure, but I just checked, and not all the image, sorry, not all the image are part of mirror.gcr.io, like BusyBox and Golang.
Okay.
So the question is it possible to ask to GCP to add those image to mirror.gcr.io?
We may not be able to move that quickly. It is something I can certainly take a look at, but I would say if we feel like there's a long tail of images that are not available there, we should look more at either using different images or attempting to set up a pull-through cache. Would be my guess. Like with BusyBox specifically, I think I'd rather suggest Alpine. So Claudia can correct me here. I feel like Alpine is better cross-platform, or is BusyBox better cross-platform?
Technically BusyBox, because we also use BusyBox on Windows tests as well. There was a pull request some time ago that was replacing the BusyBox image usage to Agnost,
Yes.
which is a typical image for pretty much most conformance tests.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been updated in a couple of months.
Okay.
I could take a look at it and rebase it and repush it again, but it had a lot of test failures as well that will have to be taken a look at. But I can do that if needed.
Maybe. The reason I'm kind of a little down on that is just that, or no, maybe you can correct me. I feel like BusyBox may often be used by, I mean, I can't see where that it's showing up here, but I could see that there might be projects that try to use BusyBox as a shorthand for, I just want bash and I want the tiniest image possible that has bash. And Agnost is larger than that because it's got all the other.
Even the binary is like 30 or 40 megabytes. So yeah.
Yeah. So it's certainly, it's an option. And then I think, I don't think I said this on camera, like I would like to send, generally speaking, we should encourage people not to use Docker Hub. We should encourage people to use gcr.io or other repositories that don't rate limit. But I'd like to provide a guide for people to change their jobs. Speaking with my SIG testing hat on, I care most about the Kubernetes jobs. And then my secondary concern is that long tail of images affecting the long tail of jobs. So the long tail thing, I feel like we should articulate that that is what may happen and describe steps they can take to not contribute to that long tail and not be vulnerable to its effects. Yeah. So You had mentioned you were interested in helping out. Where, um, what of those approaches sound best to you, or where do you think you could contribute?
Mm, the main idea I was thinking about was the mirroring thing, but if that takes a while, it won't be feasible in the next 2 weeks. I've been mostly working on the Kubernetes E2E tests and the images that are being used. So anything in that direction, I can definitely help.
Okay.
As I mentioned, I could take a look at but as I said, it won't really help for other tests outside of Kubernetes.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, I feel like I really need to answer the question of whether mirror.gcr.io is actually being used today. Uh, and then I think Arnaud took the next logical step of what are the images that are not covered by mirror.gcr.io. So we'll have to figure out something for those images, and we could survey what the scope of that looks like. And then if we're not getting the benefits of mirror.gcr.io for free, we're going to have to figure out how to do the same thing. Like,
I'm wondering if we can't host the BusyBox image in K8s.gcr.io as well. Basically use the same image builder job to basically mirror the image itself. That would just mean adding a couple of lines in the Kubernetes test images BusyBox base image and an almost empty Docker file for that. It's something that I've been doing to also include Linux images for my own manifest lists.
okay.
I was wondering about this.
Um,
And when we can confirm that mirroring works, and that's perfectly fine, I'm wondering if we can unpromote images. So this can also be like a temporary fix until we have the mirror ready for the BusyBox image.
um, I cannot recall whether, sorry, words. We cannot unpromote, but we could just not promote anything out of staging. Like, I feel like once we promote out of the staging location into k8s.gcr.io, like that, you can't go back.
Mhm.
But we could not promote, because I don't actually think we have promoted AGN host or any.
Yeah, we have promoted the Agnost
Yeah.
image a couple of times, yeah.
Okay.
I think the staging, hosting the image on the staging registry sounds like a pretty good temporary solution
Yeah.
until we can ensure the mirror works for the BusyBox.
Yeah. So I would say, yeah, let's give that a shot. I'll want to run it by Tim, just to see from a billing perspective if that makes him comfortable, and if we feel like we need mitigations in place to sort of restrict access to stuff like that.
I'll just send a pull request for that.
Sure.
It should be like a 15 minutes thing to do. And then when this is decided on, you can just approve the pull request, and then the image builder job will build that image and we'll have it in the staging registry and see if everything is working perfectly afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll CC you in the pull request when I'm done with it.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, I talked for a lot longer than I was expecting to. Sorry about that. Anybody have any other questions, comments, or concerns?
I've
Yeah, go ahead.
Like a suggestion, maybe we can promote external image in the staging repo. Like we can just add specific container staging and promote maybe Golang, and we can use that for as a mitigation to the Docker Hub issue.
So yes, I agree that's an option for us. It is less preferred for me than using mirror.gcr.io, and that's solely for the reason of funding. Just to restate it, like my concern is we're not the only open source project out there, or we're not the only people out there who are like, oh no, I don't want to pay Docker Hub money. And I just want to make sure that if we end up, putting a really popular image in one of our staging repos, that people don't organically just start using that instead of Docker Hub. So if we use mirror.gcr.io, I am fine if more people use that. That's kind of a more appropriate place because it's funded by Google, and I don't care if Google wants to pay money for that or not. But I'm thinking about this with my Kubernetes project hat on. And I don't think the Kubernetes project should be paying, the bandwidth costs for BusyBox for the entire world. We should be paying for the bandwidth of hosting BusyBox for our project and for our CI, but everybody else, yeah. So maybe I'm being overly paranoid about that. Because it would be the same. I mean, it's the same concern with any of our staging images. I get it, but that just seems like something popular like that around an event that motivates everybody to choose alternatives. It could lead to more traffic there. But if we can't use mirror.gcr.io, I think that is the next logical step, like hosting our stuff in staging.
That sounds reasonable to me. From what you showed us, the bills are pretty high as they are. So
yeah,
I wouldn't want to get to get into a stage without any kind of funding because of the costs being too high.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I have one last thing regarding the E2E test images building job. I have a pull request for that. This is basically a fix. It's been down for a couple of weeks because of me. Basically, I've taken care of an error for S390X images. Basically, each time APK was being run to install packages, it would always fail with a bad address or something like that. You can actually see the original pull request in the special notes in the message. Why it was happening, what was fixing, and so on and so forth. Even the agnost image was installing packages through APK, but it was silently failing and continuing for S39X images. And there was actually someone that was building clusters and trying to test images with that architecture. And it was failing because of that. In diagnosed image, we are installing a bind tools, which basically you have dig, and it's a common tool used for testing DNS names and so on and so forth. And since that APK command failed, of course, the S39X didn't have that program. So of course it was failing for him. After the original pull request merged, it was building for me the images. Everything went fine. Also tested in my own environment with some emulation to make sure that it's fine. But there's an issue when trying to build images inside another container, which is what the image builder does. And I replicated that in my environment as well. And of course, it was failing for me as well. And with this pull request I've sent, is basically one line of code change. It's building for me again. Currently rebuilding all the images for myself, including Windows images, and I'll post as a comment the logs as well, if anyone is curious about them. And those are images being built inside the image mentioned in the cloud build.yaml file.
Okay. That sounds valid to me. The QMU stuff is sort of before my time on the project, so I'll probably want to pull in maybe Jeff Grafton, or at the very least Ben the Elder to get eyes on that. But that it looks valid to me.
Yeah, well, we are gonna need the the image builder job for the BusyBox thing we just talked about.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds good.
Yep.
Okay, anything else?
I have a question about pro migration.
Sure.
So now GH proxy is mesh and deploy. What is the next step? Because I'm kind of lost about what's the step related to pro migration.
Okay, so the use of the GitHub proxy, it would be useful for jobs that today run on the trusted cluster, aka the same cluster that cloud.k8s.io runs on, the google.com cluster. There are likely jobs in that cluster that we would like to migrate to the community's trusted cluster. I'm thinking, and jobs that interact with GitHub's API a lot. So the biggest candidate for me would be the Parabolus jobs, and maybe the job that runs label sync, which is responsible for setting up GitHub labels on all the repos. What is less certain to me is whether we are comfortable having the K8s CI robot token put into the community-owned build cluster, or whether we're going to feel like we need a different bot token put into the community-owned cluster. The reason I say that is because K8s CI robot, for better or for worse, has access to a lot of GitHub organizations and repos that are not Kubernetes, and kind of feel like they just shouldn't be there in the first place, but they are. So from a security perspective, it's unclear to me whether we would want to expose access to all those to the community-owned build cluster. So we might want to look at using, I had created a GitHub, or there was an old GitHub account called K8s Merge Robot, or it was used by the Munge GitHub piece of infrastructure long ago when we used that instead of Tide. And I renamed that account to K8s GitHub Robot. And I believe that robot has admin access to GitHub for Kubernetes orgs. So we could use that token instead. The other thing is, I didn't actually check that GH proxy was working in the trusted cluster. I'm not sure that I'll have time to. But my thought would be trying to get, I guess the way I would look at it for next steps is I might take something small like label sync, and I wouldn't run it for all of the orgs. I would just run it, I would configure the job to run for a small org or orgs like Kubernetes client, Kubernetes CSI, for example. And I would see if that job is successfully able to talk to the GitHub proxy or not. And we might also need some way to hook that up to monitoring dashboard so we can actually see the stats that show whether or not the proxy was hit or not. And I'm sorry, I'm just making this up off the top of my head. I don't know whether it would be better to try and like hook that up to the monitoring.prow.k8s.io dashboard that we currently use, or whether we want to consider setting up our own copy of that monitoring stack. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, because I wanted to suggest we kind of deploy in your stack of Pro somewhere with the monitoring stack so we can see where are the blocking steps. Because right now I say GS proxy is also used by Ook and Crier. So if we want to talk about migration, the question is we also need to know where Pro will run.
Yeah, it is. So that's, I mean, maybe that's a larger question. I kind of wanted us to get to a place. So today, it's sort of a lazy approach that Prow is running jobs in the same cluster that Prow's components are running in, and they all talk to GitHub, and so they all benefit from talking to GH proxy. I thought that it might be a cleaner separation of concerns if we don't ever allow jobs to run on the service cluster, and we instead only run jobs in a separate cluster that is trusted. But that means that right now, GH proxy is not intended for access outside of a given cluster, kind of the same way Boscos is, right? Like you talk to the instance that lives in the cluster. So both the Prow cluster and the trusted cluster might need their own instance of GH proxy. We might end up seeing less benefit from the caching as a result of that. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we do want to follow the model where all the Prow components are hosted on the same thing. But I feel like I'd like to better understand the pros and cons of that decision. But I like your idea of setting up a sort of a staging Prow instance or something where we could just see like what access it needs to what. That sort of gets into the larger story of migrating from the existing Prow service cluster to a brand new Prow service cluster. And it's less clear to me what a seamless migration path for that will look like. But if you want to get started on sort of describing the steps there, that would be awesome.
Okay, I will try to do my best.
Okay, that sounds good. Reach out for help, ask questions. Yeah, iterating on stuff is always great.
Okay.
Okay, anything else? Well, cool. I expect this meeting to take 5 to 10 minutes, so I guess I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes back. Thank you everybody for showing up, and I hope you have a happy Wednesday.
Thank you, you too.